welcome to Talking Geopolitics, the fortnightly podcast series from Geopolitical Futures. Last weekend marked 76 years since the formal surrender of Germany in the Second World War. The Germany that was divided between four Allied powers in 1945 looks little like the Germany of today. To commemorate that event, George Friedman published a free article on the Geopolitical Futures website on Germany's enduring place at the heart of Europe. And later in the podcast, we speak with him about what's changed for Germany in those 76 years, and what hasn't. But first, fresh talks on the future of the Iran nuclear agreement began in Vienna on Friday. With Joe Biden now in the Oval Office, the future of the deal that Donald Trump famously walked away from may be decided in the next few weeks. So on this episode, we cross to Beirut to speak with our Middle East expert, Professor Hilal Khashan, about the history of Iran's nuclear program, what the talks are really about, and how parts of the Middle East are praying for an outcome. Hilal, thanks for your time today. For those of our listeners who aren't overly familiar with the background to the Iranian nuclear program, can you just set out a bit of the history?
You know, the Iranian nuclear program goes back to the 1950s when the U.S. offered to cooperate with the Shah as part of the Atoms for Peace program. And in fact, cooperation between the U.S. and Iran continued until 1979 when the revolution triumphed and the Shah left the country. Right after the revolution, Khomeini decided to dismantle the nuclear program because he did not believe it made sense. His argument was that we cannot compete with the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and therefore it wouldn't really be of any significance to the country. And as he started to dismantle the program, which coincided with the eruption of the Iran-Iraq war, many Iranian nuclear scientists fled the country. However, by 1984, when the battle began to turn against Iran, Khomeini reconsidered his position. Actually, he regretted scrapping the nuclear program because he argued that had the Iraqis knew about Iran's nuclear capabilities, they wouldn't have dared to attack Iran. Well, when the war ended in 1988, Khomeini was determined to restart the program. And with Russian assistance, the two sides agreed on working on completing the Bushehr nuclear plant, which actually started during the years of the Shah, and then it was suspended. And in 2005, the Russians announced publicly that they were completing the construction of the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Opposition in the West, especially by the US, caused Russia to scale back its nuclear cooperation with Iran, even though Russian engineers were collaborating on an individual basis with Iran. And thanks to that unofficial individual cooperation, the Iranians in 2002 announced the existence of the Natanz enrichment complex, the most important nuclear facility in Iran. A year afterwards, the Iranians began to negotiate with Germany, France, and the UK to avoid Security Council sanctions. And the Iranians concluded that it was in their best interest to start cooperating with the International Atomic Energy Agency. However, in 2004, Iran tested missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads. And that really angered the U.S., who decided to take action against Iran. Mounting international pressure and sanctions finally convinced the Iranians to start talks in 2009 with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Iran in order to avoid additional Security Council sanctions. Arduous talks led to an agreement in July 2015, the nuclear deal, which was dubbed back then the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And the deal was supposed to go into effect on January 1, 2016.
Now, Donald Trump obviously pulled the US out quite famously of that deal, but since then, and particularly since the Biden administration began in January, there's been lots of discussion around the world about what's going to happen next for that particular deal and for the Iran program. Can you just give us an update, I suppose, both on where Iran's nuclear capabilities are now and what's going on with that potential deal?
After 2016, when the deal went into effect, and in response to sanctions by the US under Trump, the Iranians are demanding that in order for them to return to the deal, all sanctions must be lifted. US makes a distinction between sanctions imposed on Iran in connection with its nuclear program and other unrelated sanctions related to Iran's actions of terrorism, ballistic missile program, human rights violations, and cyber crimes. But the Iranians say, no, all sanctions will have to be lifted, and we will immediately comply with the 2015 nuclear deal and return our level of enrichment to 3.67%. Two sides talk about progress in the negotiations. They say that they agree on the fundamental principles, but the path is long and difficult because of the sanctions.
I suppose, I mean, you touched on it there slightly, in that the US has been separating its sanctions between sanctions for the nuclear program that they've been progressing since Trump came in and walked away from the deal, and then to do with other things like terrorism and cyber crimes, whereas Iran is putting them all in the same basket. This connection, really, it's got a lot to do with Iran and its use of proxies around the Middle East, doesn't it? What's that connection?
There's no doubt that Iran is interested in proceeding with its nuclear program. However, the ruling elite in Tehran understand that Israel will not live with an Iranian nuclear bomb. And they understand that if they come close to manufacturing one, the Israelis will destroy their facilities and stop their program. Iran is interested in the process of nuclear activities without actually developing a nuclear weapon because they are aware of the consequences. However, Iran is keen on joining the nuclear club for prestige purposes and also to become a par with Israel in becoming two major poles in the region. You know, Israel is a constant pole in the region, and there is vacuum in power relations, and Iran wants to be the second pole on the region and in the region, and therefore to become a competitor with Iran, with Israel, it needs to be its equal. That is, it needs to have an active and a viable nuclear program. What Iran really wants is to become a major regional power. And this is the reason why Iran is keen on gaining allies and establishing proxies throughout the region. Actually, this was one of the components of the Iranian Revolution. Right after the revolution in 1979, Khomeini introduced Iran's Arab policy. The Arab policy became the most important component of Iranian foreign policy and aimed at spreading the revolution. And this explains why during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Iran decided to take advantage of the situation and send the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to Lebanon in order to create a paramilitary group loyal to the teachings of the supreme leader in Iran. And since then, Iran has making progress and establishing inroads in the region, be it in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen.
So what does it hope to gain out of the nuclear talks that's going to help those proxies and its ability to spread the revolution?
Recent developments in the region during the past 50 years, actually since the 1967 Arab-Israeli war, there has been a vacuum in the region. Egypt became concerned about recovering its lost land. Nasser died in 1970, and nobody was able to fill in the void left by Egypt. So Iran, after the revolution, felt that it could fill in that gap, and it began to invest in its regional proxies. And they did that remarkably well. However, the Iranians understand that in order for them to prevail in the region, they need to establish good working relations with the U.S. and eventually actually establish some sort of ties with the Israelis. The Iranians really want an exit from this state of conflict with the West and Israel, and they want to focus on development and also consolidating their regional influence.
I assume the US understands that in some ways Iran is using these talks as a means to an ends, and not the ends that the talks are actually about, being nuclear policy. So what does the US, how does the US see that? How does the US see Iran's desire to become more of a regional hegemon?
Iran is a highly nationalistic country. And when it chooses to pursue its regional ambitions, it wants to do so independently. And this is something that the U.S. may have problems with. The U.S. has excellent working relations with Israel, and the Israelis always consult with the Americans. The Saudis would not make a move without consulting with the U.S. And the same thing applies to Egypt and other countries in the region. Iran wants to be treated differently. It wants to behave on a par with the U.S. It wants to be the U.S. equal in the region, and this has been a problem in dealing with the U.S.
So, Hillel, what do you think the outcome of these talks in Vienna is going to be?
I think the Vienna talks will not come to a happy conclusion unless an agreement is reached on Iran's proxies in the region, and this explains the recent escalation in the conflict in Yemen. The Iranians are preparing themselves for the eventuality of reaching a deal and curtailing the influence of their proxies, and they want to make advances on the ground, and they want to make gains before they decide to stop their regional activities. They want to establish facts on the ground, and this explains the rapid acceleration of the fighting in Yemen and in Lebanon, actually.
You're on the ground in Beirut. Can you just tell us, what's the situation there?
The situation in Lebanon is dire. The country is highly unstable. We don't have a government, and the various factions in Lebanon are unable to agree on forming a cabinet. And economically, the country is run away. The rate of inflation during the past year has gone beyond 700%. In Lebanon, each group has its regional patron, and the political class is unwilling to agree because they have regional powers that dictate their move on the ground. And I really believe that since Lebanon is a victim of geopolitics, in order to stabilize Lebanon and get it back moving, you need to stabilize the region. Of course, stabilizing the region is out of the question. It will never happen. But however, for things to get better in Lebanon, there has to be an agreement between Iran and the U.S. Therefore, an agreement in Vienna on Iran's nuclear program and Iran's regional proxies will give a positive signal to the factions in Lebanon to start a serious effort to form a government and relaunch the country's political system and begin the process of reform. Until an agreement is reached in Vienna, the situation in Lebanon will continue to worsen.
Well, Hillel, we're wishing you all the best, and we will hopefully talk to you again very soon.
My pleasure, anytime.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.
On May the 8th, 1945, crowds poured onto the streets throughout Allied nations around the world. Now iconic images show civilians and soldiers celebrating the end of the worst conflict the world has ever known. But in Germany, surrender did not mean the end of the nightmare. Rubble filled the streets, desperate citizens queued for food, and the future was anyone's guess. The Germany of 2021 could not be more different. Now the fourth largest economy in the world and the benevolent leader of Europe, stability and prudence is the name of the German game. But despite trying to ignore it for 3 decades, a country as large as Germany can no longer avoid geopolitics in a world filling with this much tension. In a free article last week, George Friedman speculated on Germany's place in the world and the true meaning of that day in 1945. Now, that article is available on the Geopolitical Futures website, and you can find a link to it in this episode's blurb. But for our fireside chat this week, I spoke with George about Germany's future and what he meant when he wrote that May the 8th, 1945 was certainly a comma in history, but it remains to be seen if it was a period. George, good to have you back again. In this article that you wrote last week on the anniversary of the end of the Second World War, you finished the article by saying that May the 8th, 1945 was certainly a comma in history, but it remains to be seen if it was a period. What do you mean by that?
Europe's histories for millennia was the history of war. When we go back into European history in school, we read about the wars they had. In that sense, the First and Second World Wars were not unique. It was a continuation of everything that went before. The defeat of Germany seemed to be a period. That is, this is the end of war in Europe. And that was because the United States and Russia occupied Europe. They were not sovereign. They could not make decisions of war and peace. In 1991, they regained that right. The Soviet Union fell, the United States lost interest, and now they're free to go. So the question mark is, was 1945 the period, the end of the story, or was it merely a comma before the next story was told?
Well, I guess that is the question then, and in particular, it's the question for Germany, in that I think German history, it's very easy, I think, often to forget how short German history as a unified country is. It was only unified in 1871, although, of course, the idea of the German people was around a long time before that. But I think because of that, and because of the way that Germany has lived those 190 years or so, means that what Germany does now, post the fall of the Berlin Wall, post reunification, and particularly in the 21st century, it's a little bit confusing as to what it's trying to achieve in the world. What do you think it is?
We have to remember that as soon as Germany unified in 1871, it became an economic superpower in Europe. It almost immediately passed France as an economic power and was beyond Britain in many ways. This was the center of gravity of the European economy, organizing the economic system through trade all the way to the Balkans, East, West. Germany was the superpower. What has happened is that basically, with the rise of the European Union, Germany has resumed the place that it held prior to 1914, prior to World War I, as an enormously powerful economic force that was beginning to build a military force, possibly. And so we are now really back there where Germany started. Germany as the economic center of Europe, but its intentions unknown, perhaps, to everyone, including it.
I suppose the key difference, I would say, between 1914 or 1939 and now is that Germany is probably almost as far away as possible as you can get from the sort of military ideology that it had back then. It was a country that was run by aristocrats, and particularly Prussian aristocrats that came from a strong history of militarism. And the military was the center of the country, and that obviously doesn't exist anymore. It's now very much kind of sensible, restrained. I mean, Angela Merkel, who's been the chancellor for 16 years, embodies that in many ways. So with that in mind, with that difference, I mean, which is quite a fundamental difference in the way the country views itself, does that change the rules?
Well, you can view yourself any way you want. The important question is how other nations view you. So whereas the Germans view themselves as benign, careful, moderate people, if you talk to the Poles, you talk even to the French, they have a very different view of Germany. Germany as an economic power, constantly coercing neighbors in various ways, setting European economic policy. For example, Germany, very conservatively, doesn't like to do deficit financing. Well, the COVID virus and everything, China's doing it, the United States is doing it, most of Europe needs to do it. Germany is not sure that it needs to do it, and therefore Europe has neglected deficit financing to the detriment of other European countries. So while it's true that there's no concept of a shooting war with Germany, there probably wasn't one in 1935. I mean, World War I was the war to end all wars. People took that seriously. They saw nothing that would trigger a war until Hitler took power in 1932. It was the farthest thing from anyone's mind. But one thing we learn in history, what you have in mind today may have very little to do with what tomorrow brings. You don't decide on history, you live it. So the United States really never anticipated 9/11. Okay? It was not in their minds, but it was in the minds of other people. And that's what has to be remembered, that wars and other things do not happen because you choose them. They happen because very powerful forces out of your control compelled them.
So do you think in many ways that Germany's role in the center of Europe and its largest economy and sort of geographically being the dominating force there, does that mean it's somewhat inevitable that it will always play this role of, I don't want to say military power, but strong power, and will be forced to use that power?
Well, we have to remember that Germany has shown itself to be both resilient and powerful. It's built into the structure of Germany. It's built into the nation far more than the aristocracy was. Germany is powerful. A powerful economic nation shapes much of the lives of the people around it. It shapes what the European Central Bank is going to do. It shapes what kind of imports or exports. It shapes what kind of deal will be made with Britain when Britain leaves, as Britain leaves. So when we take a look at Germany, it affects everyone's life, and many people don't like that. Now, that hasn't reached the point of rage. It hasn't, perhaps never will, But Germany is not beloved in many parts of Europe, and the regime it's created for Europe hurts many people under it. Britain left because it really didn't want to be part of this system. Other countries may leave anyway, but the question is, how far does Germany go to preserve its economic power? That power guarantees the German public the kind of life they wanted. It is not an aggressive military power, but it is power nevertheless. So as people get more and more agitated, Germany's desire to be simultaneously seen as placid and pacific, nevertheless wielding all this power, may be met with other forces.
Do you think Germany wants that power? Do they want that position there?
Well, whether they want it or not, they have it, and they've had it ever since World War I. But more to the point, of course they do. It allows them to guarantee their prosperity. It opens to them, the European Union opened them areas of Europe where they could dominate and trade. It effectively has given them control of the European Central Bank, which determines economic life in Europe. Of course they don't want to give that away. Now, do they mean harm by it? I don't know. I can't look in the hearts of men and women whether they mean harm. But from the standpoint of others sitting around saying, I have to live in a regime of the EU that is not in my best interest. And Germany is demanding this regime, and I blame Germany for it. So intentions have very little to do with it.
I think I want then to talk about the German-French relationship in the modern day, because that has obviously always been a very important relationship for Germany. And I don't really need to explain why. But I think, the sort of idea that we're coming across here is that Germany, particularly at the moment, is rather happy appearing to be the sort of benign power in the middle of Europe. But you can contrast that particularly to France right now, which seems to very much be having an identity crisis, and it's very eager to appear to be very important on the world and European stage. In the last few weeks alone, we've had French generals writing letters, saying that a civil war is coming. We've had fishing boat protests, and then, gunboat diplomacy essentially in the English Channel between Britain and France around the island of Jersey to do with fishing rights. It's all very kind of, look at me, we're important. That contrast is quite significant at the moment. How do you see that?
Well, first, France is important. When you look at history, France has played a critical role in European history. Interestingly, Macron visited Napoleon's tomb. And there was a point to that, which is the way that the European Union is constructed. Germany plays the leading role, France a supporting role. In doing that, the French feel not just pride hurt, but interest hurt. So Germany's desire, for example, to avoid military confrontation runs counter to the French need to have some order in the Mediterranean. The French proceed with that, the Germans won't. So the things that used to take France and Germany and put them each other's throat to the point of murder aren't there yet. But France is not prepared to subjugate its autonomy to Germany, partly because of historic memories. They're not trivial, but more to the point that there are things that France wants and needs that Germany doesn't. And so when you see the French moving about the Mediterranean, they're not engaged in a frivolous activity. Their southern shore is on the Mediterranean. They have an interest in protecting it. What happens in North Africa, for example, matters to the French. And the problem they have is that the leading power of Europe, Germany, is not on the Mediterranean, doesn't want to be involved in that. So there's going to be inevitably a divergence between their interests. And the French, in order to do that, have to build a sense of nationhood. The EU has undermined a sense of nationhood in favor of mythical European identity. Well, the French can't assert its needs and its interests while the French people don't understand that it means something to be French. So these things are not irrational things that are being done. From the outside, they seem very strange. But Macron knows what he has to try to do. Whether he'll succeed or not, I don't know. He has to build a French identity. He has to be able to demonstrate that France is assertive. It has to show the British that even on a trivial matter such as fishing rights, which is not trivial to the French, it will stand up for France. And one of the differences between them and the European Union is the French are interested in their rights, where the myth of the European Union is that there's only European rights. Very different.
We've had a question in from a reader, and now to circle back to the start and this question of whether May the 8th, 1945 was a comma or a period, the reader asks whether you think the EU and NATO are also commas or periods.
Well, I see it as a comma. What's ancient in Europe and elsewhere are nations. People who speak your language, people who share your values, people who are like you. The European Union is merely an alliance. It is a treaty. It is written in Maastricht. It is not a nation. And the idea of a European identity is very strange to me. I was born in Hungary. I can assure you that Hungarians are nothing like Belgians. They don't want the same things. They don't share the dreams. What the European Union promised was peace and prosperity. Okay, well, who doesn't want that? And while it was supplying both, it was okay. Now, of course, at the same time that it was founded, 100,000 people were being killed in the Balkans during the Yugoslavian civil wars. European peace was far from there. The European Union solved that by saying, well, they're not really in Europe, or they're not in the EU, or something like that. It's not us. But now we have a situation where prosperity is in question. The COVID crisis, 2008, and the immigration crisis were three events that strained the fabric of the EU. This crisis the most, because what it did was create the one thing that the EU promised not to create, a lack of prosperity. And the question is, how do the Europeans rebuild that prosperity? How can it be done? And how can it be done in such a way that Poland participates in that prosperity as much as Denmark? And it has to be that way, because it's not that way, then it's not the universality that was predicted. Well, obviously, that's not going to be easy to do. I don't see how it can be done. And in that sense, the underlying principles of the EU are under assault. What remains, as Macron has shown, is the nation state, France. As Poland has shown, what exists is the state, nation state. And as the UK has shown what exists, the nation state. So this has been a very short experiment in European history at this point. 30 years is not very long. And now it's facing the test. Does it deliver prosperity on an equitable basis throughout Europe? And the Germans are very interested in German prosperity, the French in French prosperity, the Romanians in Romanian prosperity, and so on. When you go through all of these people, how do you recover from COVID? And the problem is that these governments in each of these countries are answerable to their people, not to Brussels. So long as everything was working, it was quite all right. When it stops working, they're going to get elected by their own countrymen, and they will try to satisfy their countrymen's needs. And so the idea both of European identity and European unity are facing their very serious test. And to me, nations live a very long time. Treaties come and go.
And would you say it's the same with NATO?
Well, NATO is already, the Europeans have abandoned NATO. They have an agreement to pay 2% of the GDP for defense. They've not done that. The United States has done that. NATO means that every nation is carrying out its obligations. The Europeans don't see NATO as a critical element. They don't see a threat. The Americans see only a marginal threat. So it's an atavistic formation. It existed to fight the Soviet Union, and it doesn't seem that we're going to be fighting them anytime soon, so it's not there. Again, NATO was just a treaty. It was a treaty to achieve a purpose. It achieved the purpose, and so on. EU is just a treaty. It's not a nation. It is not Europe.
George Friedman, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And that is all we have time for on this episode of Talking Geopolitics. Thank you very much for listening. And remember, you can find all of Hillel's and George's writing on the Geopolitical Futures website. Just go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast. And we will be back in 2 weeks. So until then, you have a great fortnight and take care.
You've been listening to Talking Geopolitics from the team at Geopolitical Futures. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to Talking Geopolitics wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear your comments and questions. Go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast to leave your feedback. That's geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.